Can you hear me? All right, so unfortunately I do not speak Italian, so I'm going to speak and then pause and there will be a translator, correct? Everyone's listening? Okay, so I will try to talk as slowly as possible. And I tend to walk around when I speak, so forgive me if you're following me. So a brief introduction. My name is Sarah Holloway. I'm a professor at Columbia University in New York City. I have worked at Columbia for 7 years. Prior to that, I started in 1991 working in the nonprofit sector in New York City. In 1996, I started a nonprofit that works in the public school system, and while I was running the nonprofit, which I thought I was making up as I went along, I went to Columbia to get my master's degree, and then I worked as a management consultant for 10 years in the nonprofit sector, and started teaching 7 years ago, as I said. So what I'm going to discuss today may sound negative at the beginning, but really I want to talk about the challenges of the sector, and then I want to talk about the opportunities. Before I start, one thing I say to my students, who are all looking for jobs when they leave Columbia, is that the greatest skill you can take with you is raising money. If you can raise money, you can get a job in any economy. So I think you're all in a very good place. So my agenda for today, I'm going to give a brief overview of the nonprofit sector in the United States. I will talk about its challenges, and then I will talk about what I'm calling a new model, which is called social enterprise or social business. There are lots of different terms for it. And then I'm going to talk about 4 social enterprises I think are doing amazing work that are based in New York City. And then I want to have a discussion about philanthropy and fundraising and the future. Okay, so I'm going to walk over here. I'm sorry. So just quick data. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Oh, great. That makes things easier. Thank you. So the nonprofit sector in the United States is huge. 1.6 million nonprofits. The sector has grown significantly since the Second World War. 90% of nonprofits were born in the past 50 or so years. And the number of nonprofits in the US has doubled in the past 10 years. I will say most of my students at Columbia want to start new nonprofits. And I often say it's very difficult to start a nonprofit, but they all have dreams and ideas, and so there's great hope in the world for that. Since you're all focused on fundraising, a little bit about where the money comes from. I think some people find this surprising. Most people think charity is supported by donations. In the United States, 73% of revenues come from fee-for-service, nonprofits selling a service. That could be to government, or it could be a daycare center or a school charging tuition. So only 22% of revenue comes from gifts and contributions. So I'm going to talk briefly about that. I don't know if you can see this at all. So of the 22%, this is where the money comes from. 73% of those donations are from individuals. Again, I think there's a myth in the United States, at least, that most contributions come from foundations like Gates or Rockefeller or from corporations, but most of the money that's given to nonprofits is from individuals. And most of that money goes to, as you can see, religion, religious organizations, and education. All right, so now on to sort of my discussion on nonprofits and what I see as their dysfunction. And the challenges in the sector, and some people think I'm very negative about this, but I do believe that many nonprofits, the 1.6 million, I'd say a good percentage of those could go away, and it wouldn't hurt the sector. I think a lot of nonprofits are not functional, aren't well run, and some of that's a challenge of management, but mostly it's a challenge because the sector is itself dysfunctional. As Valerio mentioned, funders, they don't understand that there's a need for overhead, right? People just want to pay for programs. If you ask somebody to give a donation to pay for a scholarship for a child, they will do it. If you ask, can you fund our organization because we need help, they're less likely to. People want tangible. They want to fund a program. They want to fund something they understand. So that's a huge challenge of the sector. Another challenge of the sector related to money is resources, right? I was an executive director of a nonprofit. I was also the chief financial officer, the chief operating officer, the chief relationship manager. I had 15 different jobs, right? It's very hard to run an organization without resources and without support. And if the funding community isn't willing to pay for that support, you're always going to be under-resourced, and it's going to be hard to do a good job. So that's a huge challenge of the sector. And that's why this new model that's focused more on diverse sources of funding, on earned income, and on running more efficiently like a business is going to emerge and is going to change the sector overall. One big challenge with nonprofits is that people think it's charity. They don't think it has to be great. The expectations are very low. I worked as a consultant with a nonprofit that was started by the CEO of the Citibank. And there were five CEOs of what are called Fortune 50. Does everyone know what that means? Companies. American Express, Citibank. 5 of them on the board. The organization lost $1 million a year for 3 years in a row. And no one asked why. Not that they didn't care, they just ended up writing a check. But they didn't expect the business to run as well as Citibank or American Express, right? So the expectations of the sector are incredibly low. That is a problem. Now, I helped this organization turn itself around so they weren't losing money. But I think the challenge is that board members and the general public don't expect excellence. And that's a real challenge. Now, I'm speaking slightly about the past because I think it's changing dramatically. Because there's so much competition for money, nonprofits know they need to do better. And one big thing is that, you've probably heard this all now, and I think Valerio mentioned a little bit, it's about impact, right? People don't just want to give to charity because it feels good. They also want to know where their money's going and the impact it's having. And that's something that's really happening in the United States right now, is people want to see if I put $1 in, what comes out, right? And that's easy to see in a program that is focused on job creation, for example. You put in $1 to a job training program, somebody gets a job, the outcome may be $20, right? Because they have a salary, they're employed, they have long-term benefit. The same thing can't be applied to a program that feeds the homeless, right? It's hard to put a dollar value on that, but at the same time, people are demanding that data, right? That's also helping to change the sector. We used to focus on outcomes, right? Numbers. You often see in reports from nonprofits that say, we served 10,000 people, right? That's no longer enough, right? So what? You served 10,000 people. What did you do? What was the ultimate impact on those people's lives, right? And that's the data people are looking for right now. One challenge, and I think we've talked about this today already, nonprofits are less focused on doing good and doing well than on raising money, right? When I ran a nonprofit, excuse me, I can honestly say that 90% of my day was spent thinking about money and raising money. And that is true for most organizations, particularly small organizations. Now, obviously, it depends where your money's from. Excuse me, I'm going to get some water. Thank you. So if you raise money from individuals, that's very expensive. If you raise money from the Gates Foundation and you get a $10 million grant, that's more efficient, right? But most organizations raise dollar by dollar by dollar. Thank you. Am I speaking too quickly or it's okay? Thank you. But again, I think the biggest challenge is that most nonprofits are just focused on raising money, and they're thinking less about, are we doing a good job? I say this in my class. Everyone here knows Excel, the program Excel. You develop your budget in Excel. Most nonprofits I know, at the end of the year, they take Excel, budget 2012, and they hit Save As, budget 2013. The assumption is, let's do it all over again, we're doing a good job, and let's just try to raise the money again. They rarely say, let's start from scratch. Are we doing well? Should we keep this program? Should we drop this program? It's about perpetuation, and it's about employment, right? There are people in these jobs, so everyone wants to just move on, keep paying people, keep doing what they're doing, but people rarely look at, are we doing a good job? Valerio talked about this a lot. Funders don't really get it either. The expectation is, we'll give you programmatic dollars, and you need to deliver on what we give you. Right? That is very difficult. It's very hard to run a nonprofit if you're 90% is going to programs. Right? In the United States, the Internal Revenue Service oversees all nonprofits. And every year, every nonprofit has to file what's called an information return. It's like taxes. It's like you're paying taxes and you're filing your taxes, but you don't actually pay tax. And that information return divides your expenses in 3 categories: program, fundraising, and administration. And as Valerio mentioned, what everybody looks at is what percentage is going to programs. And they are comparing one organization to another and saying, they give 86% to programs, they're better. It depends what they do, right? You can't compare apples to oranges. If a program is very service-oriented on the ground, they're going to have more administrative expense probably than a program that's based purely on the internet, right? You have to look at the organization relative to what they do and then determine whether that's efficient or not. The other challenge is fundraising expense, which, as we all know, is a lot higher than people report. Is not allowed to be considered a programmatic expense. So an administrative expense like an executive director, you can put a portion of that onto programs. So 30% of my salary could be a programmatic expense, 30% could be fundraising, and 40% could be administrative. All fundraising expense is considered pure overhead. So if you raise money from individuals and you have a big fundraising staff, or you have to hire a grant writer because you're writing a grant to the US government that requires a lot of expertise, those expenses are considered overhead. And that's going to change your percentage, and people see that as bad, even though it's quite necessary. So that's, again, a huge, huge challenge. Until the funding community understands that there's a need for overhead, nonprofits are going to be stuck in this position. I don't know how it works in Italy, but most grants you apply for from foundations are for programs. There's something called general operating support that some foundations give, but it's very rare. Right? I think if I ran a foundation, I always said I would give unrestricted money, and I would give it quickly. Right? If they came and asked me for a grant, I'd say, I'll send you a check tomorrow. Right? It can take 3 months, 6 months. It can take a long time to get the money in the door, which is a huge cash flow challenge for nonprofits. So until the funding community changes, this is going to be a problem. That said, I'm going to give an example of the opposite of this. I recently raised money for a program in the New York City school system from the Rockefeller Foundation. And we submitted a budget that was the program budget. And Rockefeller came back and said, we require 15% overhead line above your budget in order to fund you. Because they understood that it takes money to deliver on the program, not just the program costs. So that was positive, but that was really the first time I've heard that. Another thing I want to mention about the Rockefeller Foundation, when we submitted the budget, the nonprofit that was applying for funding is a young organization with very young employees who don't make a lot of money. And when I put the budget together for them, I looked at the expenses, the personnel expenses, and I said, Rockefeller is going to look at this budget and think you're not going to be able to pull this off based on the salaries you're giving. Right? Someone in New York City making $30,000 is probably not experienced enough to run a major program in the New York City public schools. Right? So I would vote for increasing salaries. Right? And in general, I think the sector doesn't pay very well. But I think that's changing as well. But I personally believe that you pay people well in the sector because they'll stay with the job, right? Your retention rates will be higher. They'll value the job more. People want to feel good about the work they're doing, and if they're paid well, they'll appreciate that. So I think that needs to shift in the sector as well. In terms of fundraising efficiency, right, this is a general number. This is not true of all nonprofits, but nonprofits spend between 20 and 28 cents in reality. This is not what they report. This is what they actually spend to raise a dollar. And again, it depends on the type of organization, what's appropriate. For some, it may be 5%. For some, it may be 40%. But this in itself, I think, is a real challenge. And I wrote here, it would actually be cheaper to take out a bank loan, right? If you're spending 20 cents to raise a dollar, that's expensive. Again, there need to be other methods to do this, and things like earned income can help mitigate that. So now I want to talk about opportunities in the sector and how I think the sector will shift. Again, lots of challenges in the sector, people doing good work, but I think the sector itself is flawed. I always say I don't like the term nonprofit, right? I teach a nonprofit finance course, and the first thing I say to my students is, forget the word nonprofit. If you don't make a profit every year, you're going to go out of business, right? You need to have some margin or you can't operate, right? The goal is not to have a zero balance. The goal is to have operating reserves, right? So nonprofit, that term, I think is flawed in itself. All right, so new models. So as I said, the term social enterprise, I don't know if you use the term here in Italy, but it's a term that's now thrown around a lot. It's like sustainability. You hear it every 10 minutes. I call it social business or social enterprise. Really, it's just well-run organizations. I have a description here. There are lots of different definitions for social enterprise. To me, a social enterprise is a social business. The goal is social, but it's well run. It has diverse sources of revenue. It's sustainable. It's scalable. Here are some things I use to define it. It has either a double or a triple bottom line, right? So double bottom line means social and financial. Triple is if it's also sustainable, right? If it's helping the environment. There's clear ways to measure impact, right? I mentioned before, one of the challenges with the sector is that it's sometimes very hard to understand what is the true impact of your dollar. In the for-profit sector, it's easy. Either you're making money or you're not making money. In the public sector, it's sometimes fuzzy, right? So in a social business, sometimes it's easier to define that impact because that's part of their business model, right? When they design their social enterprise, they think about what is our desired impact and how will we know when we're achieving it. So that's built into the business itself. Transparency, right? One challenge I think a lot of people have with the sector is they're not sure where their money's going. They think it's going into a black hole, right? Transparency says, here's where your dollar's going, here's how we operate, here's our budget, right? In the past, I think nonprofits hid information, right? The nonprofits that do well now, at least in the United States, have everything up on the internet. Their financial statements, the salaries, et cetera. In the US, the report you give to the Internal Revenue Service every year lists the top 5 salaries of every employee, right? Everything is now very transparent. And all of the websites that judge the nonprofit sector, one of them is called Charity Navigator. One thing they're judging is that transparency. Is information available? So that's important. Sustainability. Again, this term is overused, at least in America. Is it sustainable? To me, sustainable does not mean you don't raise money, right? That's a myth. You will always probably raise charitable dollars if you're doing social good. There are very few nonprofits I've seen that are purely profitable, right? There's always going to be some charity there, right? But sustainability means you're diverse, right? You're not reliant on one donor or one type of donor, right? If all your money's from the financial sector and there's a recession, your organization's going to struggle. So sustainability to me means diversity. Scalability. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in the nonprofit sector is you have a model that works, how do you scale it? And people talk about scale a lot, and I don't think I know the true key to scale, but what I think some of these social businesses have done well is they're focused. To me, the most successful organizations are the most focused, right? You often meet nonprofits and you say, what do you do? And it takes them 20 minutes to describe what they do because they do so many different things. And part of that's because they want to serve community, and part of it's because nonprofits have had to be opportunistic, right? You go after the money, right? There's money over here for a program, let's go do that. When you're really focused on one thing, what you do uniquely well, it's easier to scale. And I think some of these businesses have done that well. And then adaptable. A lot of nonprofits are scared of change, right? We as people are often scared of change. And I think organizations that evolve and are willing to change and adapt are going to do well because the world is changing every day. I ran a nonprofit in the school system that focused on technology. And we changed our business model multiple times because technology changed. When I started it, there were computers and computer labs and no wireless and no internet. Now it's not even about computers anymore. It's about apps and phones and different devices. So the organization had to evolve based on need. How am I doing on time? 10 minutes? All right, so I'm going to sort of speed past some of this and talk about some of my examples. These are just examples of the type of businesses nonprofits have started that are what are called social ventures, right? And they often focus on something like job training or workforce development, housing. And then on the right are the types of businesses that they have started. Training business, catering, food service. But let me get to the organizations that I want to talk about. There are 4 I'm going to highlight. I'm just focusing on organizations in New York City because I know them well, but there are thousands of these around the world. One is called Housing Works. Housing Works serves the homeless and homeless with HIV/AIDS. It was started about 25 years ago. The organization raises money, but they also have businesses they operate that bring in profit. And that profit is put into the mission of the organization. For example, they have 12 thrift shops. Thrift shops are, I don't know if you know that term, a secondhand store. You bring your clothing or your shoes or your old TV and people buy them. They operate a bookstore and a cafe. And they also have a catering business. And what's interesting about this model is, 1, it makes money, but 2, people want to support models like this. So if I'm going to hire a caterer for my event, and the proceeds of that event are going to go to a nonprofit, I'm more likely to give money to them, right? So they have an advantage over other businesses in the same space because people feel good about hiring them. So there are 2 bottom lines here in terms of their businesses. 1, they're making money. They raise $10 million annually from these businesses. That's not profit, that's the gross. But they raise $10 million, which is 25% of their operating budget. The second advantage is that they're employing people in these businesses, right? There are hundreds of employees working in these businesses who otherwise wouldn't have a job. So 2 benefits there. Donors Choose is an organization I personally think is a fantastic model. It was started by a friend of mine who was a New York City public school teacher. And he, like many teachers, used to go and buy supplies for his classroom because he didn't have a budget. He'd buy pencils, he'd buy books, etc. So he set up a website where people can go and teachers post projects of things they want, right? So a teacher needs videos, or a teacher needs a camera, or a teacher needs books. And you, as a donor, can go on the website and pick a project anywhere in the United States. You can go to the school that you went to in first grade, or you can focus on a project you like, right? If you're particularly interested in technology, you can fund a technology project. So this is the model. So the teachers ask, so this is demand-driven. I mentioned this briefly. One challenge I have with nonprofits is it's not always demand-driven, right? Nonprofits decide what services are needed, and then they show up. That's particularly true in education. One quick anecdote I forgot to tell. I worked with a corporate foundation in Hartford, Connecticut, which is the insurance capital of America, second worst school system in the country, and the corporate foundation wanted to know if they were having an impact in their programming in the schools. And I interviewed the school system superintendent, who was new, and he said the worst performing school in the city, in the second worst district in the United States, so this is a very bad school, had 22 nonprofits providing service. 22, who were literally not having an impact. And the problem was the school didn't ask them to be there. They just showed up, which is how the model has worked in the past, right? We think you need us, and you show up and it's free, and people say yes to free, right? That's not an effective model. This is effective because it's teacher-driven. The teachers are saying, we want this, and you know they're going to use it if you pay for it, right? And that's satisfying to a donor. So essentially, this is the model. What's been amazing, they've raised $165 million in products in about the past 7 years that they've existed. So they've funded millions and millions of projects and helped a good chunk of students in the United States. In fact, half of all schools in the United States have utilized this service. 1 million people have supported it. What's interesting about this model, although they raised charitable dollars to start, which is what often happens with a social business, you raise startup money and you say to the donor, if you give me money now, I will be sustainable in 3 years, right? So it's an investment. The way they operate now is when you check out, right? You go online, you put your credit card in, they will ask you if you're willing to pay for their overhead costs to operate the nonprofit. And 76% of people say yes, right? And those proceeds support the organization. Hot Bread Kitchen was started by an alumni of Columbia in my program. And it's what's called a social purpose bakery. Essentially, it's a business that trains immigrant women in New York City to bake and then places them in jobs in the culinary industry. I don't know if you can read this data here, but basically they make about 30 different breads, ethnic breads from the home countries of these women, and they sell them all over the city. And they've been so successful in their bread business that they generate about $1.5 million a year in bread sales. So in fact, they've been so successful that their model has changed, right? The first mission was train women and then place them in jobs. Their business is so successful that they're keeping them in the business. So they employ about, I think it's about 50 women now in their bread business. They operate 24 hours a day. And the goal is to be fully sustainable on the bread sales in the next couple of years. What they will continue to raise money for is that they teach these women English. So they have English classes, and the training program will always be philanthropically supported. But the operating business is supported through these sales. They are incidentally trying to figure out how to scale their model and having some challenges in terms of that. Mouse, as in the old days we used computer mice, we no longer use them. This is the organization that I started in 1997 to initially bridge the gap between technology and education in New York City. New York City public schools are it's the largest school system in the country. I love the statistic. So there are 1.1 million students in the city schools. 1 in every 280 Americans is currently enrolled in a New York City public school. It's a massive system that is actually massively failing these children. It's a huge challenge. There's 1,700 schools in 1,200 school buildings. It's a huge system. And there are about between 50 and 500 computers per school and 0 technical support for those computers. Does anyone here know the industry standard in business of how many technicians you would have per computer? Or sorry, how many computers per one technician? All right, it's 1 in 30, right? So for every 30 computers, you'd have 1 technical support person. Schools have 500 computers, 0, right? The gym teacher or the math teacher who happens to be the technician. So the mouse model, the mouse model is actually to train students, middle school and high school students, to be the tech support technicians for their school. Right, which has 2 bottom lines. It supports the school and its technology and teachers, but it also provides a skill and youth development and empowerment for these young people. So the model, which I said was started in New York in 1997, I left in 2003. I like startups. I like to build things, but I don't like to maintain them. So at some point I said, time for me to move on. But the organization, is in 5 states right now. And then it's in about 60 countries through a partnership with Microsoft. So when Microsoft sells software to the Jordanian school system, they couple it with this student-powered tech support model. And that relationship with Microsoft has given the organization about 3 years of operating budget in a reserve fund, because every time they sell the product, the organization gets some revenue. One thing that's been important for the organization to figure out is what, as we talked earlier, what is the value of the program and the impact. This is one way they look at it, right? So on average, the students work 14 hours a week, 42 weeks a year, so that's 588 hours. The organization worked with Citibank and their tech support help desk to determine the value of those hours and came up with this formula. So basically they're looking at about $20,000 per school in value, meaning the school would have to have paid $20,000 for that level of service. I actually think these are very conservative numbers. Because if you have 500 computers in a school, you'd need 3 or 4 technicians who each make about $50,000. So that would probably be about $200,000 per school. So this is conservative. So the value of the organization's programs now is about 6.6 million according to this formula. The organization's budget is about $1.5 million a year. This is a quick snapshot of where the money's from. So the organization continues to raise money from folks like Google, Microsoft, Best Buy. Best Buy is a computer store that's probably the biggest partner with the organization and is now working with it to scale. And, but 38% of the revenue is earned. Right, and some of that earned revenue comes from schools itself. Right, so every school pays $999 for the program. The reason for that is twofold. 1, it's revenue, but 2, I think people value things they pay for. If you give them a free program, they may not pay attention to it. Even if it's a low-cost program, the principal is going to pay attention because they're paying for the program, so that's important. I just went to a meeting with the organization about their scaling plan, and I actually said, I think you need to charge schools more money, right? Because I think they'd be willing to pay more, and that's a more sustainable model for you if you can scale it. And then the city of New York pays a portion of the cost per school, right? So that's government funding. You have to basically lobby to get that. That's a big effort as well. And then private donors. One way they've sold the program and fundraising is sales, right? And packaging is that they basically say to the private donor, we have a big chunk of the money covered through public donations, will you match those? Right, so no one feels the burden of the program. They feel like they're sharing the burden, right? And private donors like to hear that government is putting money in, particularly in a government-funded thing like a school. So maybe we should open this to discussion about the future, or I can, I think I've covered some of this in my talk. I don't mean to say there's not a need to fundraise in the future. I think it's just about smarter fundraising, and it's about smarter organizations that are looking to be diverse, not dependent not just on one donor, but on one source of donors, on one sector. So maybe we can open it for questions, or it's a... Oh, okay, sorry. So essentially my overview of what's happening in the United States, and I think globally, right? I think it's about smarter, more efficient organizations that are doing good work that's tangible, right? That's about impact. I'm about to host a conference in Washington, D.C. with 20 what are called fellows who are running social businesses. And they filled out a form about what tangible skills they wanted to learn. And most of them said they want to learn how to sell their idea quickly, right? You're no longer writing 20-page proposals. People don't read anymore, right? They want it in an email that's that long. I did a business plan for a hospital for a new floor, and it was a 20-page business plan, and the donor came back and he said, can you get it in 1 page? Right? People want to hear, they want to know, what are you doing? What's the impact? Where's my dollar going? Right? So the workshop I'm going to do is what's called the elevator pitch. Right? It's a 3-minute, you're in the elevator with somebody, you need to sell your idea in 3 minutes. So it's basically helping these social entrepreneurs develop their 3-minute pitch. And I think your job as fundraisers is to figure out what are the most important things you're selling, right? People don't want extra information anymore. They want to hear what's important, right? What do you do? How do I know you do it well? And what's going to be the impact of my dollar? So thank you very much. It's been amazing to be here in Italy. Thank you.